Well, on Bob and Yurt Live, we normally do not talk about the Bible per se, the doctrine and theology in the Bible. We talk about issues. But this is different because here we are in Israel, in fact, in Jerusalem. And behind me, you can see the Gold Dome, which is the Dome of the Rock, but also that Muslim mosque is built on the site of Solomon's Temple. And that's why we're here in the land of the Bible, to find out as much as we can, to do some investigation about the historical foundations of our faith. Is there real evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, or did the New Testament writers lie about his resurrection? While non-Christians reject the resurrection, the world, the unbelieving world, does believe in the historical person of Jesus Christ. He was born at the time of the census that was ordered by Caesar Augustus, and Christ died during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Now, even his crucifixion is taken by the world as a matter of historical fact. To begin, we'll look at some just secular authorities. We've got a Webster's Dictionary here, an Encyclopedia Britannica. Let's start with Webster's, and under the entry for Pilate, and we've got this so you can see it. Pontius Pilate, a 1st century AD Roman procurator of Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, who condemned Jesus to be crucified. Right, and he was procurator about 26 to 36 AD, approximately. All right, now, so Pontius Pilate was a real person. Jesus Christ was a real person. In fact, let's take a look, and we'll zoom in on this in a little bit, but I'm going to start out bringing you some excerpts from an article in Encyclopedia Britannica on crucifixion. This here is on page 266 of Volume 3 of their Micropedia. And let's see here. Notice the similarities in this account to the Bible's description of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Crucifixion. In the ancient world, the method of capital punishment, particularly among the Persians, Jews, Carthaginians, and Romans. There were various methods of performing crucifixion. Usually, the condemned man, after being whipped, dragged the crossbeam of his cross to the place of punishment, where the upright shaft was already fixed. There he was stripped of his clothing and bound fast with outstretched arms to the crossbeam, or nailed firmly to it through the wrists. The crossbeam was then raised against the upright shaft and made fast to it about 10 feet above the ground. Next, the feet were tightly bound or nailed to the upright shaft. This is a sad story of crucifixion, and one that the Bible records. This is what occurred to Jesus Christ. Over the criminal's head was placed a notice stating his name and crime: Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Death, apparently by exhaustion or by heart failure, could be hastened by breaking the legs with an iron club. All right, and now what I'd like to, we're told here that crucifixion was thought to be a suitable punishment for political or religious agitators. Right? I like to zoom in a bit here because we find out that, well, Darius, the king of Persia, crucified 3,000 political opponents in Babylon. That was in 519 BC. And we can look at others in ancient times that were crucified, but let's go down to the very last 2 lines of that quote out of Encyclopedia Britannica. And about AD 32, Pontius Pilate crucified Jesus of Nazareth. So Christ was crucified, we know that. But did the apostles lie about the resurrection? There are 2 things that they could not have lied about. The apostles, those who wrote the Bible, they could not have lied about the geography of Jerusalem, and they could not have lied about the historical writings in the Old Testament. We'll look at the evidence of history and geography. We'll throw in a little bit of archaeology and compare all that with the written affidavits of Investigators and eyewitnesses from the first century. The law of the Jews, recorded by Moses, long time ago, 3,500 years ago, Moses said it was written in stone. You know, if you violated that law, parts of it, you were to be put to death. Well, God, according to Moses, wrote his law in stone. Well, in the New Testament, God wrote in stone again. Only this time it was the account of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. You see, the background of that story, the resurrection, is the history of the nation of Israel. And the resurrection account itself, the fact, was it a fact? That's what we're investigating. Of the resurrection of Jesus Christ was written in stone, only this time that stone is all of Mount Moriah. The very mountain that the city of Jerusalem was built upon. It's exciting stuff. Mount Moriah's story begins in Genesis, chapter 22, the story of Abraham being called. In fact, it says right here in this book, and if you look at manuscripts, handwritten manuscripts of this book, the Bible, going back hundreds and even 2,000 years ago, it's virtually identical to the books you buy in the stores today. God said to Abraham in Genesis chapter 22, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there." Offer him as a sacrifice. Kill him and offer him to God. Offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Very important mountain to God. This episode ends with a prophecy that in this mount, in the mount of the Lord, it shall be provided. Well, what shall be provided? Christians say that God provided the sacrifice of his only son, Jesus Christ, since Jesus Christ died on Abraham's Mount Moriah. Did you know that? That's what we're going to explore and show in this video. It's the same hill that the Temple Mount was on, Solomon's temple. David had an experience there, and God pointed out the very spot where the sacrifice should be provided. That was the mountain that Jesus Christ was crucified on. And to this day, a tomb remains in Jerusalem. It's called Jerusalem's Garden Tomb. It's at a place of a skull. And there is overwhelming evidence that shows that that empty tomb is the tomb of Christ's resurrection. The study of Mount Moriah, while it goes all the way back to Abraham and Isaac, it brings us through a point in history 3,000 years ago with King David, Israel's King David. In fact, there's a book, the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. And in that book, there's a central episode, and it begins with God being very angry at rebellious Israel. And we're going to look at some of the quotes of this chapter 21 in 1 Chronicles. The Lord said to David, "I offer you 3 punishments. Choose one." This is because Israel had been wicked. Either 3 years of famine, or 3 months to be defeated by your enemies with the sword, or 3 days, just 3 days, with the sword of the Lord, with the angel of the Lord destroying throughout all the territory of Israel. Recall, you break Moses' law, well, if you break it severely enough, the penalty is death. And that's what Israel had deserved. And David said, "I am in great distress. Please let me fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercies are very great. But do not let me fall into the hands of my enemies." So the Lord sent his angel with a plague upon Israel, and 70,000 men of Israel fell. And God sent an angel. As the angel was going through the nation, the angel came to Jerusalem to destroy it. And as he was destroying, the Lord looked and relented of the disaster and said to the angel who was destroying, "It is enough. Now restrain your hand." And the angel of the Lord stood by the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. Now, who's this Ornan the Jebusite guy? Well, he's a Jebusite, and he had a threshing floor. He had fields, wheat, and he would thresh the wheat on his threshing floor, of course. Well, at that very spot, God gave mercy to Israel by ceasing the punishment that they actually deserved. Wouldn't it be interesting if that spot turned out to be on Mount Moriah? We'll look into that in a little bit, but let's continue. Then David lifted his eyes and saw the angel of the Lord standing between the earth and heaven, having in his hand a drawn sword stretched out over Jerusalem. Then the angel of the Lord, let me read this here. The angel of the Lord commanded his prophet to say to David that David should go and erect an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. So, now this threshing floor has become an important place, right? Well, let's see. Let's follow the story. Now, Ornan turned and saw the angel, and his 4 sons who were with him, they hid themselves, but Ornan continued threshing wheat. He's working there. He's threshing. He's a farmer. He's successful, obviously, to own this land just north of David's city of Jerusalem, right up the hill. Then David came to Ornan. Now, David's the king of Israel, right? And Ornan looked and saw David, and David said to Ornan, "Grant me the place of this threshing floor, that I may build an altar on it to the Lord." Now, this is verse 22, and this is interesting. Ornan is working right there on the threshing floor, and David says, "I need to sacrifice to the Lord on your land." Ornan, well, go right ahead, David. Well, I need to do it on your threshing floor. Right here where I'm working, right here in this very spot. And David said, "You shall grant it to me at the full price, that the plague may be withdrawn from the people." You see, the full price for wickedness has to be paid. And here in 1 Chronicles 21, verse 22, David purchased the threshing floor from Ornan the Jebusite. The plot thickens. It might be a little confusing, but it becomes fascinating. Amazingly, according to the historic record, and I call it historic because the Bible was a book written in history. Whether you think it's the inspired word of God or not, it was written many centuries, in fact millennia ago. According to the historic record, Mount Moriah was the site of Abraham's offering of Isaac, of David's altar that he built on Ornan's threshing floor, and of Solomon's temple. Now let's read right now the relevant passage that links at least a couple of those events together. In 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1, a really fascinating passage. Here we go. Now Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. Wow. Where the Lord had appeared to his father David at the place that David had prepared on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. That Ornan never knew how famous he'd become, but he really had. The Jebusites, by the way, they ruled Jerusalem, that area, and there was a spring there, and that's why the city was located at that spot. At the time David became king. And the Jebusites were descended from, the flood, Noah, his son Ham, his son Canaan. So they were one of the Canaanites, basically. Well, this information is historical. It's not theological or spiritual. It's history. It's the history of the world and of the human race. Let's look at the Encyclopedia Britannica again, only this time in their Macropedia, volume 10. I'm going to go to the article on Jerusalem, if I can find it here. Here we go. And we've got a close-up. There's a section here, The Ancient Origins of Jerusalem. And we've got a close-up. Hopefully you'll be able to read it at home. I'll read it to you. About the year 1000 BC, Jerusalem was captured by David, founder of the joint kingdom of Israel and Judah, and the city became the Jewish capital. His successor, King Solomon, extended the city and built his temple on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. This foundation determined the sacred character of Jerusalem as a center of monotheism. And that's really what God was doing in the Bible. God wasn't just interested in this particular rock for the sake of the rock, or this site for the... God had a message to declare to the world, and he was using the nation of Israel in very specific geographic and historic context to teach certain spiritual truths to the world. So Solomon built the temple, according to that passage there, 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1. Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, the center stage in the drama of the Bible story of sacrifice for sin. Prophecies are not very amazing if they were written after the events they prophesied, right? But if they were written before those events, well, then they demand our respect, especially if they hold up to scrutiny. Well, how about the prophecies of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, regarding the life of Jesus Christ, who lived about 2,000 years ago? When were those prophecies written? Were they written before he lived? If so, they present a powerful argument to the truth of the Bible and who Jesus Christ is. Well, the Old Testament prophecies of Christ were written hundreds of years before Jesus Christ was born. How do we know that? Again, we'll turn to secular authorities. H.G. Wells wrote a massive 2-volume history. It's called The Outline of History, and it really is massive. I've been looking at it on and off now for some years, originally published in 1920. And I'm going to turn to page 253 and quote something about the Jews. And in fact, H.G. Wells calls their book the first book of power in the world. The first book to be written that gave real value and strength to the people who read it. Now here we go. Here's some fascinating information. H.G. Wells, by the way, was an enemy of Christianity. He was no friend of Jesus Christ, Christians, or the Jewish religion. Here's what he wrote from a historical perspective. We are now in a position to place in their proper relationship to this general outline of human history the Israelites and the most remarkable collection of ancient documents in the world. That collection, which is known to all Christian peoples as the Old Testament. All right, now I'm going to skip to the next paragraph. All the books that constitute the Old Testament were certainly in existence and in very much their present form at the latest by the year 100 BC, 100 years before Christ. Most of the books of the Old Testament were probably recognized as sacred writings in the time of Alexander the Great, 330 years before Christ. Now that's from H.G. Wells, and he's accurate on that is accurate history. When we go to the Encyclopedia Britannica again, all right, I have a close-up that I'm. Let's see. No, I don't have a close-up. I'm just going to read this to you. Their entry on biblical literature, and this is in their Macropedia, Volume 2 of this edition that I own. A section on the Septuagint. Now, the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew, a little bit Aramaic, and it was translated into Greek hundreds of years before Jesus Christ was born, so that we know that it was written hundreds of years before, because we already had another version in Greek so that the Greeks could read it. And here on their article on biblical literature, a section on the Septuagint. The story of the Greek translation of the Pentateuch, that's the first 5 books of Moses, the law, that forms a major portion, and it's one of the earliest parts of the Hebrew Old Testament. The story of the Greek translation of the Pentateuch is told in the letter of Aristeas. Now, Aristeas was a Greek official at the Egyptian court of Ptolemy II Philadelphus. He lived 286 to 245 BC. So he lived almost 300 years before Christ. It recounts how the laws of the Jews were translated, this letter, into Greek by Jewish scholars sent from Jerusalem at the request of the king. The Septuagint Pentateuch was probably first translated by a company of scholars in Alexandria, in Egypt, about the middle of the 3rd century before Christ. Neat. Right? So the scholars of the world recognize that the Old Testament was written centuries before, virtually all, if not all of it, centuries before the birth of Jesus Christ. Well, then we have another question to answer. How accurate? That was a long time ago. They didn't have printing presses. We got our copies, handwritten manuscripts. How accurate is our Old Testament today compared to the Old Testament that Jesus would have read 2,000 years ago? Well, the answer to that question, now, atheists and people who despise Christianity and the Bible, they've suggested that it'd probably be nothing like it. There'd be so many mistakes in it. It'd be so different. After all these centuries, it would have changed. You wouldn't even recognize the original. They are wrong. How do we know that? Because up until recently, up until 1947, the oldest manuscripts we had of the Old Testament were about 1,000 years old, handwritten. Now that's 1,000 years after Jesus and 2,000, 2,500 years after they were written. Well, in one fell swoop, it's called the Dead Sea Scrolls, we being the human race, discovered manuscripts of the Old Testament that go back to the time of Jesus Christ and even just before. And what we found out, I'm going to show you where these were found. I have in my hands photographs my wife Cheryl and I took while in Israel of the Qumran caves. And you can see there, that cave is where a shepherd boy actually had a goat got loose and fell into that hole in the top of the cave there. And he had to go in to rescue his goat. And I think we have a close-up. Is that the close-up? And he went in and discovered documents, which we call today the Dead Sea Scrolls. And those Dead Sea Scrolls, they went in and they found a number of caves in this area in Israel at the Dead Sea, just a little bit north of Masada. And there was a community, an ancient community, the Essenes. And they wrote these scrolls. Some of them were just copies of the Bible, and others were their own beliefs and their own records of deeds and real estate transactions and contracts and all this. And what we find out when we read these manuscripts of the Bible is that our Bibles today are almost identical. The Hebrew text we translate from Hebrew to English so we can read it. Those of us who don't read Hebrew. Our Hebrew text we use today and the translations we have are virtually identical, virtually, to the Bible that Jesus Christ read from when he was alive 2,000 years ago. So we know that the Old Testament prophecies were written hundreds of years before Christ, and we know that when he stood in the temple and read from the Bible, he was reading the same stories, the same words, the same ideas that we're reading today, 2,000 years later. Now, what we're going to do is turn to one of those passages that Jesus Christ, in fact, he quoted from this, Psalm 22, written by David, when he was on the cross. Jesus Christ was on the cross and he cried out, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which being translated is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And that was, people try to understand what Jesus meant by saying that, and it's important that we figure that out, but something else he was doing, that was the first verse of Psalm 22. He was calling people's attention to Psalm 22 when he was on the cross. so that we should look and see, what did David write? And what we're going to read is fascinating. All right, the first verse, my God, why have you forsaken me? Then we're going to go down to verse 7. All those, and notice, when you hear this written 1,000 years before Jesus Christ, notice the similarity. This is a prophecy of what would happen to the Messiah 1,000 years later. All those who see me laugh me to scorn. They say, he trusted in the Lord, let the Lord rescue him. Now I'm going to go down to verse 14. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It has melted within me. My tongue clings to my jaws. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. And now in verse 16, for dogs have surrounded me. Now, Gentile dogs, right? Wasn't it Pilate that gave the order to have him crucified? And Roman soldiers are the ones who actually killed Jesus Christ? Dogs, Gentiles. For dogs have surrounded me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. In other words, none of my bones are broken. They have pierced my hands and my feet. You know, a lot of people object to that translation. They say, oh, the Hebrew doesn't have to be translated, because if David really wrote that 1,000 years before Christ, this is about the Messiah, wow, that's pretty compelling evidence. So some people who want to take away the deity of Jesus Christ, that he's not God the Son, he's not the Savior, he didn't rise from the dead, they say the Hebrew doesn't have to be translated that way. As with many languages, all languages, there's sometimes variation in the way something could be translated. And they say, you shouldn't translate it. They pierced my hands and my feet. They say, that's a bad translation. But you know what? When you look at the Septuagint that was translated hundreds of years before Jesus Christ, how did they translate this passage? From Hebrew. David wrote it in Hebrew. They translated it into Greek. You know what they wrote? They wrote, they pierced my hands and my feet. And why is David saying that? Why is it's in the first person, right? David was not crucified. God moved him to write this to prophesy of his son Jesus Christ, who would die on Mount Moriah, in Isaac's place, in David's place, in the place of all Israel and all who would believe in God. Jesus Christ died for them. Wow, it's really absolutely incredible. Now we'll go to the New Testament. We'll look at a few verses in Matthew and then in John. The Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of John. And we'll tie them in. We'll refresh our memories as to the specifics of Christ's crucifixion. I'm going to start in Matthew chapter 27 in verse 27. Then the soldiers of the governor, Pilate, took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole garrison around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. When they had twisted a crown of thorns, they took thorns, they put it on his head, and a reed in his right hand, and they bowed the knee before him, mocking him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! Then they spat on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. Then when they had mocked him, they took the robe off him, put on his own clothes, and led him away to be crucified. All right, now we're going to go to verse 33. And when they had come to a place called Golgotha, that is to say, a place of the skull. In Latin, Calvary. All right, Hebrew, Golgotha. They gave him sour wine mingled with gall to drink. But when he had tasted it, he would not drink. That's because in another gospel we read he cried out, I thirst. Then they crucified him and divided his garments, casting lots. Verse 37. And they put up over his head the accusation that was written against him. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. They did that in 3 languages. Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. So that all the world would know what was happening. Verse 41. Likewise, the chief priests, also mocking with the scribes and elders, said, He trusted in God. Let the Lord deliver him. Wow. All right, now we're going to go to John. We're going to go over to the Gospel of John. Sorry, let me make